Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to Lacan Scotland's Halloween special or October session, and we're delighted today to have our very own Olly Cutler join us. And Olly is going to be presenting on Jonathan Glazer's 2013 film Under the Skin, particularly focusing on the monstrous allure in Under the Skin. This is part of Olly's research for his PhD, so we have a lot of work in progress pulling together here into what I think is going to be a very interesting and topical, given today being Halloween, presentation. Before we jump into the presentation, Olly, just very quickly for everyone else, a bit of housekeeping. If you're joining us on YouTube, please hit the like button and follow us. So thank you for joining us tonight. Olly, thank you particularly for joining us and for the presentation to come.
Great, thanks, Calum, and hello everyone. Can I just check? Can you see my? Because I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to show you some visuals throughout, seeing as I'm speaking about a film. Can you see my screen? Okay. Okay, perfect. So tonight, as it's Halloween, I'm going to speak to you about a science fiction horror film. I'm going to speak to you about the dramatization of desire in Jonathan Glazer's film Under the Skin. So my argument tonight is, I hope, going to be not necessarily straightforward, but easy enough to follow. I'm going to argue that the reduction of the central character's body to a fantasy object is a critique of the patriarchist fantasy undergirding the visual culture of the lads mag. Now, you might not be familiar with what a lads mag is, because I realize these things are called different things in different parts of the world. This is this really peculiar cultural artifact that we see across the slides here. And there are four examples on your screen just now. Now, these magazines are part of a visual culture alongside both video and still pornography that have been theorized as being connected to sexual violence through their normalization of a constantly eroticized feminine body. Now, the film deliberately imitates the coding of Scarlett Johansson's body from within this visual register. The Lads Mag adopts a framework that reduces woman to imaginary sexualized body and supports the logic of the phallic exception. So what the magazines tell us is there's clearly someone out there who is able to enjoy these women without constraint. And perhaps if you're a heterosexual man or a homosexual woman or a bisexual woman, it could be you. However, the film does not simply reinscribe the ideology of this framework, even though, as we can see, Scarlett Johansson herself has appeared on front of one of these magazines. It works from within this ideology. It uses similar tools, but it works to subvert it. Now, I'm aware that some of you won't be familiar with the film, so I'll offer you a brief synopsis. It follows an alluring alien played by Scarlett Johansson that you can see on your screen just now with a black background. He's a type of Black Widow who has been costumed by a mysterious male, and that's important, minder, through stereotypical signifiers of feminine sexuality. So she's dressed in stockings, red lipstick, and a short skirt. But that's just the outside layer. Underneath this outfit is another layer. It's a lifelike skin, and it's this skin from which the name of the film arises. It's a skin made from human flesh that was recovered from a comatose woman in a ditch by the alien's minder. So this disguise is multi-layered. It's a Frankenstein-like reconstruction from another's body, and it helps the alien to remain unnoticed as she combs the streets of Glasgow here in Scotland, looking for male victims to lure back to her lair and into what I will call her pool. Now, the word monstrum, which is the Latin origin of monster, refers to a type of warning, a divine or evil omen indicating misfortune, or a type of portent. The closely linked monstare means to show. So, what is it that Johansson's anxiety-inducing monster shows, reveals, or warns us about? Now, the answer, I think, and this is what I'll argue, can be found in Glazer's representation of the alien's pool, which I'll show you, which I think holds the key to the film. Okay, and here's some images from the alien's pool that you'll be familiar with if you've seen the film. So tonight, if you'll allow me, I'd like to take you along on a little thought experiment. What happens if we read the motif of the alien's pool and the alien's role within this pool, this black space that you can see on your screen here? What happens if we read that pool as having parallels with the Lacanian concept of das Ding? Could we accept it as an analog for das Ding and how das Ding operates? Could we accept that as a veiling of das Ding, it reveals how the law, prohibition, and desire operate? Could we accept that as an imaginary stand-in for the lads mag trope of the always up for it feminine mode of sexuality, it actually indicates little more than the deficiency of patriarchist fantasy? Now, this is a term that I'll use over and over again tonight, so I'll define it for you from the outset. What is patriarchist fantasy? I'm going to use it to argue that it's a mode of ideological fantasy. It's a fantasy that's articulated in visual culture and spreads further than just that visual culture, where woman's alterity is reduced to body and sex. It's coded erotically, and the enigma of woman's desire, woman's chevoir, is supposedly known by men. This is the logic of the fantasy. It's a phallic fantasy that seeks to contain woman's otherness, and it's a fantasy, I think, that the film serves to turn inside out. Okay, so das Ding. Lacan raises das Ding, as I'm sure you'll be aware, in Seminar 7, in the context of the apparent misalignment between his and Freud's theories of psychic representations. To shore up his definition, Lacan draws out the distinction between the two words for thing in Freudian theory. Lacan argues that repression, and I quote here, operates on nothing other than signifiers. So those objects that are a product, and again, this is Lacan, of industry and human action as governed by language, or die Sache in German, are not the same as the thing, or das Ding. Representations of die Sache are those belonging to the symbolic, while das Ding is the thing in the register of the real. And yet, and here is the crux of the concept's salience for the film, das Ding is irreducible to symbolization and exists outside of language as the beyond of the signified. Now, it's often argued that later formulations of the objet petit a are traceable to this original formulation of das Ding, where, as Slavoj Žižek puts it, the objet petit a can be seen as the remnants of the thing following symbolization, or in a different way of putting it, Ellie Ragland, I really like this way of describing this movement. Ragland calls the a the traces of jouissance that remain after castration has anesthetized it. So, as Richard Boothby argues, das Ding exists as the hollow point from which subjects attempt to reconcile perceptions that they're experiencing and those memories of previously enjoyed objects. And this all follows on from the first pleasurable and yet hostile encounter with a fellow human being. This is the Freudian Nebenmensch or neighbor. our subsequent interactions with others are therefore comprised of two dimensions. So, on the one hand, we have that which is familiar and recalls our own body in some way. And then in the other, there is always that anxiety-inducing part, which is completely alien, a fremder, which holds together as a thing. So, the thing that makes Dasting unusual and unique is that the subject believes that the first satisfying object that they encountered still exists, but is now somehow lost. So Dasting becomes organized by the subjective compulsion born out of the subject's structure to re-find this lost object. But the object never really was lost in the first place. And indeed, it's the search, the continual search for the object that generates a type of enjoyment. But what does this mean? What are the implications of this? So, as Lacan argues in the seminar, a series of objects and practices will come to occupy the absent void of Dasting, all of which can be elevated to what Lacan calls a dignified status. And Lacan famously gives the examples of his friend with the empty matchboxes. And he also explains in great depth the lady of the courtly love tradition as examples of elevated things. But these objects don't get raised up because of anything that truly inheres in them. It's their positionality in fantasy's symbolic structure that leads to this elevated status. So Dasting is both fundamental to us, but it's also paradoxically separate from the subject. So in one sense, it's deeply intimate and interior to us. It shapes our entire desiring life. But even though, as Jacques Miller explains really, really nicely, the thing that's intimately shaping our psychic life is also extimate to it. It's exterior to it. Now, the pleasure principle operates here by obstructing our access to jouissance. It effectively commands the subject to enjoy as moderately as possible, keeping the subject in the realm of signification and creating as many barriers as possible to maintain psychic tension. And we really see this in the film. So this distance that exists between subject and object is informed by the prohibition for the mother's body, which then becomes subsumed into the prohibition against the desire for the thing. Now, Lacan accepts that the mother can inhabit the position of Dasting with desire for the mother as the fundamental desire, but, and this is one of the many reasons why I think most recently Todd McGowan argued why we see the movement from Dasting to objet pétillard is Lacan is always cautious and becomes even more cautious not to overplay this formulation with its dyadic overtones. So Dasting, interestingly, and I'm not going to go into this in too much depth tonight, just going to time constraints and the focus of the presentation, but Dasting really is something of a hapax in Lacan's work. And yet it keeps returning elsewhere. It's all over Lacanian theory. Post-Lacanian theory. It appears in film studies and literary studies as a means of interpreting motifs of absence. In an excellent analysis of the unnameable thing in film and literature, Maria Bevel argues that both cinematic and literary attempts to render the thing boil down to efforts to represent the absolute other, unsurprisingly. But she argues that representation is always going to fail to capture the absolute alterity of the thing. So in Bevel's assessment, the thing will remain representationally inscrutable. And in a manner of speaking, it operates sovereignly. It's separate from subjectivity. Bevel, and I like this about Bevel, she remains reluctant to categorize the monster taxonomically. She's not going to tell you about the iconography of the monster. She's not going to tell you about genre so much. She argues that this type of quantification, and I completely follow her logic here, attenuates the otherness of the monster. It attenuates its ability to evade. Well, she argues it does evade epistemological frameworks. So the monster for Bevel, and I'm quoting Bevel here, retreats from the reality of the thing it once signified when we try and quantify it in this way. So I agree with her overall thesis, but in the case of this film, in the case of Under the Skin, I'm not so convinced that the thingness of the thing, sorry, the thingness of the monster, so the thingness of Scarlett Johansson's alien, ever really exists autonomously, nor that its monstrosity ebbs away in its cinematic articulation. So if one reads the alien's pool as an analogue for the impossible jouissance of Das Ding, one might very well reach the conclusion that the film's narrative maintains Das Ding's prohibition and impossibility. Subjects in the film, so the alien's male victims, come close to the good that's promised by the alien's pool, which is sex with the alien. That's what she promises. That's what the film promises from her. But they never actually experience it. So I think that the thingness of the pool serves its function only in relation to those subjects whose desire is directed towards it. Indeed, speaking more broadly, in any film, thingness only becomes discernible through cinematic articulation. No matter which way you try and represent it, you have to articulate something for any thingness to become discernible. And indeed, in any subliminatory activity, there needs to be a lack to be filled. Without the representation in Under the Skin of the alien's victim's desires, there's no thing to speak of. We can't access it without articulating the alien's victim's desires. And indeed, it's the atypicality, which I'll show you, and an absence that inheres in the alien's pool that means that as much as the spectator does not experience an explicit confrontation with Das Ding, we can't, it's impossible. This is as close as the spectator is going to get. So more recent scholarship on Das Ding, again, applies it in all different ways, and some of which are really pertinent to my argument this evening. So Todd McGowan reads Das Ding in relation to capital. He argues that the association of the thing and its related enjoyment with transgression is a major oversight from Lacan. McGowan argues that it's not possible for sublimation to both elevate objects to Das Ding's dignity and for prohibition to create Das Ding. These two things can't be reconciled, says McGowan. Now, I'm not so sure about that formulation, but something that is relevant to this argument this evening is McGowan's thesis that Das Ding can be understood as a resistance to the logic of commodity, which reduces all objects to their exchange value. I think that the collision between the logic of the image of woman as capitalist object of exchange and the distorted idealization of woman the film dramatizes is really, really significant. But I'll return to that later on. McGowan also argues that against capitalist logic, enjoyment is conditional on Das Ding's subliminatory nature. But there's a tension in the interplay between capitalism and Das Ding. So McGowan says capitalism tries to erase the object's singularity. It reduces everything just to their exchange value. But it also relies on the sublimation that's generative of Das Ding. So desire for commodities, he says, arises out of this residue of sublimation, which is still present within them. Sheila Kavanagh and Sheldon George consider sublimation differently and apply it really, really differently. Sheldon George analyzes the sublimation of race and how in the American South the figure of the white lady, and he links this to the lady of courtly love, is sublimated and juxtaposed with the licentious black body. Sheila Kavanagh approaches things completely different and argues that courtly love and its encircling of the thing is predicated on a type of phallic jouissance, unsurprisingly. She argues that the idealized lady in the courtly love tradition functions as a support for the masculine position. But courtly love elevates the lady to the status of the phallus. She acts as a signifier rather than as a flesh and blood subject. And for Kavanagh, this has really important and yet to be explored significance for women. So I'll return to this idea of an elevated woman operating as a signifier of desire in my discussion of the alien. Okay, now I've spoken a lot about the background there, so I want to return to the film and to help orient the discussion and the next part of the presentation. I'd like to show you a brief clip of the pool. So what you're going to see here is a part of a really bizarre seduction routine, which is repeated as a mode of drive satisfaction throughout the film as Johansson's alien walks backwards on the top of the pool surface and her victim slips beneath it. So this is one of her victims here. Okay, I'll show you the clip and then I'll move on to the reading of the film. I'm now going to provide a reading of how the film can be read as an analogue of Dasting's operations and how Lacanian theory can illuminate the film's critique of patriarchist fantasy and certain elements of a visual culture which was contemporaneous with the film that debases women. Lacan argues that, and this is Seminar 7 again, that Dasting, the law, and desire are interwoven. And as Calum explains in his book on ethics, Dasting can't be conceived without the law there to prohibit it, and the law requires something to prohibit for it to function as law. In the cinematic object, as Todd McGowan argues in his book on the gaze, ordinary subjective prohibition can be tinkered with in a way that's not possible in everyday reality. That which normally remains prohibited and unseen can be glimpsed at, even if only momentarily. So ordinarily, Dasting's inexplicability leads to its misidentification as the subject's good. But as Lacan demonstrates with the example of St. Martin and the beggar, how do we know what our good would be? The alien's pool fails to deliver the good, leaving the spectator and the alien's victim to hypothesize that, well, maybe if this encounter wasn't was not the good that I was expecting, maybe it is it for the alien. Paradoxically, though, transgression of the pleasure principle and the attainment of Dasting would actually be unbearable for the subject. The subject couldn't withstand the extreme good, the overwhelming jouissance that would result from such an encounter. But as Lacan argues in the seminar, jouissance is still accessible to the subject. It's accessible through acts that transgress, that defy the social phallic order. Now, bringing all of this to bear on film theory, Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine, her theory from the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, and something she's actually just revisited quite recently, she theorizes transgression quite differently, but she still links it to the prohibited maternal body. So Creed doesn't actually mention Dasting explicitly, but her argument's clearly informed by it. In her argument, she says that cinematic characters and settings that are abject, so she's using Julia Kristeva's sense of the abject, are somehow threatening to the phallic order. So the abject threatens to collapse the distinction between subject and object, indicating that the subject could return to an undifferentiated state. And this threatens the sense of a bodily wholeness and a bodily limit that all subjects cling to, having misrecognized their bodies as complete during the mirror stage. The monstrous in the horror film incites a disturbance of the symbolic order, says Creed. It abjectly threatens its security and what it prohibits. Now, in Under the Skin, and on the right of your screen just now, we see more than one victim visibly trepidatious about pursuing the alien. by going into this house or into the van or into the flat, any of these places that house her pool. But they weigh up that sex with this beautiful woman is still their good, but it isn't. They become trapped in the pool, with one and presumably all eventually mutilated in quite a gruesome way. And I suppose despite this gruesome end, there is still some jouissance in the preceding pursuit that's accessed via transgression. So the men still access the jouissance associated with the pursuit of the alien's beautiful body, but this arises from what Lorenzo Chiesa calls a paradoxical lack of satisfaction. The alien's body forever remains out of reach. The men that follow the alien into the pool breaks several conservative norms governing sexual conduct. So they've only known the alien for a matter of minutes before engaging in this quasi-sexual encounter with her. And they willingly ignore or they fail to recognize the danger of getting into a van with a stranger. As Cheryl Vint argues, that the threat of sexual violence here is deliberately lessened by the inversion of putting a woman into the driver's seat. But the alien's transgressive in a way that paradoxically reflects the discourse of desire particular to the Lance mag. She is up for it, but the it that she's up for is not the it that the patriarchist ideological fantasy told us it would be. So like Creed's later theorization of the female, often lesbian vampire, the alien's sexual boldness undermines the normal symbolic customs that govern sexual conduct. And these customs, feminist theorists suggest, over and over again, are fundamental to the perpetuation of patriarchal society. But the alien's seductive repertoire is really disruptive to this. It's abject insofar as it serves a single monstrous purpose. So in the film, we're constantly seeing this cold and efficient feigning of interest, an assessment of a man's suitability for capture. So the alien asks a series of questions to establish how suitable this man is to capture and critically whether or not anybody will notice if he doesn't return home. And this series of questions, the only time that we see Johansson's face and body animated with anything really resembling humanity, those questions are the only punctuation between the first contact between her and the man and the entrance into her lair with its presumption of sex. The alien is also interstitially abject. She's between living and dead. She's between human and non-human. She's between masculine predator and feminine lure. Now, of course, for Lacan, unconscious sexuality is structured by the other's desire and demand. It's governed not just by the prohibitory laws of I suppose the prohibitory force of law and culture, but it's governed by jouissance and language. From a masculine structuration, what is pursued is a type of fabrication. And in the film, this is embodied in the fabricated form of the phantasmatic alien. Prohibited primary objects, which were once tied to the mother's body, projected onto the alien as a fantasy object. But the film examines the failure of the fantasy. Now, in Seminar 7, Lacan focuses his attention on how sublimation operates in relation to desire. He examines the medieval courtly love tradition and the figure of the lady, which he argues is an illustration of how De Sacer can be sublimated to the dignity of the thing. The sublimation of courtly love involves the subject pursuing nothing. And in this tradition, the lyrical poets, known as the troubadours, pursued the thing which was embodied in the lady, but they met nothing as the woman as subject was not really there. But As Sheila Kavanagh suggests, this not nothingness was the objet pétillard, the object cause of the troubadour's desire. The object lady herself just inhabited an emptiness. Now, we can see courtly love as being inhuman, and indeed that's how Lacan theorizes it. Flesh and blood women were not really pursued in love, they were just reduced to signifiers. And indeed, when we watch the film, it's really difficult to extricate ourselves from the signifiers that encircle Scarlett Johansson. We've heard time and time again that Scarlett Johansson is the most beautiful actress alive. And as a spectator, it's difficult to separate ourselves from those signifiers. Ellie Ragland argues that Lacan's theory of courtly love theorizes how the non-rapport cannot be synthesized. She argues that the non-rapport can never be conquered by love, nor can it make one from two. Courtly love was no more than an illusion designed to make up for the absence of harmonious relations between the sexes, a structure that we see reflected in the alien's pool. Now, Ragland argued that woman is normally bound by her maternal role in relation to the drives, and that courtly love elevates her to the dignity of the thing. Lacan suggests that subjects are continually looking for a repetition of their lost primary jouissance associated with the mother's body, which first activated their desire. And as Sheila Kavanagh argues, the detours that keep the lady unattainable and desire alive are analogous to how all of us, all subjects, are alienated in the signifier, and is also analogous to how the mother's body is prohibited through the incest taboo. Ragland argues that the lady is switched for the objet pétillard, the traces of jouissance that remain after castration has anesthetized jouissance. But she argues there's some jouissance that remains inhabiting the fissures in the symbolic. Fantasy will always retain and maintain that memory of jouissance. The loss of this primary jouissance, which is inextricably tied to the mother's body, is never resolved. But, and I suppose this is crucial for how the men in the film experience the pool, the subject achieves a type of painful enjoyment when they repeatedly miss their object. Now, this repetition of the missed object is not something sadistic in the pool as much as you might choose to read it that way. I think something else is happening. In courtly love, if the subject was to become aware that the clutch of signification couldn't be revoked, the lady's object becomes catastrophic. And in much the same way, the mirage of the alien's beauty turns into something horrifying when we learn that the men in the pool are trapped. So when a man, if you've seen the film, sinks into the pool, he and the spectator are left to analyze the alien. We're repeatedly shown the alien at the edge of the frame. She's constantly walking away. And this distortion of the visual field operates almost like the object cause of our desire. I think that the pool sublimates the alien into the ascendant object of desire that literally cannot be touched. So the lady and the alien are pursued elliptically. Direct pursuit of the alien, walking across the pool's surface, leads to missing the object. Both courtly love and the alien's pool put limits into action. They keep their respective ladies as forever beyond reach, and they both disguise the aggression that's directed towards the thing. The alien remains as a veiled nothingness, always out of reach, but always elevated, so that the horrific encounter with Das Ding need not be experienced. And yet, a really horrific fate, if you've seen the film, does await the men. As Slavoj Žižek and Tom McGowan argue repeatedly in their work on ideological fantasy and film, ideological filmic fantasies tend to culminate in sexual union. We all like a happy romantic ending. But this film reveals how the ideological fantasies peddled by Hollywood or lads mags or pornography, those that visually code women with what Laura Mulvey calls to be looked atness, have consequences beyond individual psychic suffering. When they normalize the debasement of women, suggesting that a woman coded for erotic impact will somehow replace a lost primary jouissance, they actually warp desire. A fundamental feature of courtly love was a type of sexual restraint, what Lacan calls an erotics of holding back. In Under the Skin, the aliens' victims also hold back, but in quite a different way. The pool guarantees deprivation. It perpetuates desire by establishing a barrier between the man and the alien, a barrier which is, of course, absent in the undifferentiated encounter between the child and the mother. Now, if you've read the novel, and I'm always told not to speak about the novel when I'm speaking about the film, but I'm going to do it anyway. The novel of Under the Skin tells us why this barrier is erected, but the film doesn't. So my question is, or my series of questions, why does the alien strip off? Why does she have her victims do the same? Why do the men need to be set into this state of arousal, this state of desire, but prevented from having sex? This is a type of not quite of enjoyment. It's almost like the not quite of the not all. And it's analogous to the limit that exists within the idealized image of the woman as always sexually available. So the film inverts the ideological fantasy. It has it walk off the page. The ideological fantasy of woman is always up for it adopts a similarly rapacious structure. And in so doing, Glazer critiques its paradigm. Now, films are always already ideological. As Slavoj Žižek demonstrates, ideology exists as a fantasy construction. It props up what we might call our reality. It provides the framework for our social relations and conceals the real, impossible core of subjectivity. It makes reality palatable, if you like. And indeed, as Camoli and Narboni argued in the 1970s, the camera is never ideologically neutral. It captures the vague, this is Camoli and Narboni, the vague, unformulated, untheorized, unthought out world of the dominant ideology. But the subject matter in Under the Skin is not explicitly political. It's a science fiction horror film. For most of its narrative, Glazer ostensibly inverts the stereotypical structure of men as active sexual predator, as we often see depicted, and woman as passive sexual prey. But he destabilizes the ontological categories of man and woman in the process through this inversion. But I think his reversal of these roles presents a deliberate malfunction. So as Griselda Pollock theorizes in her work on what's wrong with images of women, the parallel history of men in the role of passive sexual objects or victims of sexual violence is absent from our representational culture. Our prevailing signification, which is inscribed indelibly in our collective symbolic framework, represents woman as mother, woman as body, and woman as sex. Glazer situates the film's ideological position through where he places his final cut. So it follows the brutal attempted rape and then burning of the alien's body by a logger, who's the character that you see at the bottom of your screen there, in the woods. the film makes it, again, to return to Frankenstein, a Frankenstein-like switch where the alien's responsibility is mitigated by the what we see as the unrelenting nature of her oppression. Historically speaking, the film appeared at a time where the tying of jouissance to images of sexually suggestive women was undergoing a shift. So in the 2000s, you'll be aware images of unclothed women stared out from lads' mags upon newsagent shelves across the UK. The same mode of images repeatedly articulated in the film to activate male desire. Sexist attitudes and a foregrounding of male sexual desires prevailed across their pages. So the film is a comment on this, and the film examines the pervasiveness of sexual violence that women are subjected to. And even when a female character is shown in the position of a masculinized predator, is still oppressed as a type of sex worker, with her agency forever undermined by her minder and a series of other minders that we see spread out in one of the scenes of the film. Now, in her death, as she's doused with petrol and burned alive by the logger, she experiences an appalling violence that indicates the extreme end of the patriarchist logic that the film critiques. Because if, as Annette Kuhn argues, women can be constructed in images as fantasy objects, they can be styled seductively and styled with suggestive come hither look, then their otherness can be contained. The film's conclusion represents the alien's thingness, though, in a way that can only be contained through just an appalling act of violence. So this little montage of images here, if you haven't seen the film, is what happens at the film's conclusion. Following the attempted rape, the alien's skin is torn by the logger and her true inner body is exposed. Now, the only way the logger can deal with this is by destroying the alien's body. And this destruction at the film's conclusion, as the alien burns, really calls out to us. I was reminded of the son from the father's dream told to Freud and recounted by Lacan. The alien makes the same call to us. Don't you see that I'm burning? The film confronts the desire for the up for it woman with the real core, which is not just a lack. It's not just that she's not really up for it, but we're confronted with a real presence, which I think is the reproach to the spectator about sexual violence. If women flee from their assigned role in masculinist fantasy, the corrective sought in the real world can be really violent. Indeed, while the film was being shot, the South African Deputy President Jacob Zuma stood trial for rape. You'll be familiar with this case, I'm sure. Zuma was eventually acquitted. However, during the trial, those backing Zuma displayed placards reading "Burn the bitch," calling for the burning alive of his accuser, Fezekele Kuzweo. And in a strange metonymic switch when the trial concluded, Kuzweo and her mother's home was in fact burned to the ground. I think the film suggests to us that when powerful men or any man, in fact, is accused of rape, or if a sex worker flees her captor, the phallic order is going to kick back. And similarly, when the logger approaches the impossible jouissance too directly, his fantasy collapses and the abject thingness of the alien's body is revealed. I think the film calls out to us to say that there can be no disruption to the ideology of sexual violence without first confronting where it comes from. Now, this is an incredibly complex issue, but if we accept that the aggression originally directed towards the mother's body is redirected towards woman, and that woman is both idealized and then prohibited, we can see how in certain circumstances, sexual violence emerges. So in the film, while the men in the pool reveal themselves as castrated, the logger clearly represents one who believes himself to have the phallus to be able to enjoy without restraint. And I think that his actions reveal that, as Caputi and Russell argue, femicide and rape are not freak events. They're extreme articulations of patriarchal terror, a brutal force, as Caputi and Russell have it, that maintains the phallic order. Now, in a slightly different way, but kind of thematically connected, according to the logic of consent culture, where all desire is reducible to a kind of signified contract of consent. This is a logic that Catherine Angell critiques in a fantastic book about when will sex be good again. So according to this logic, the logic of consent culture, women should be able to articulate their desire. But at the same time, they need to contend with the male belief that it is they who know what women want. Unknowing, then, is emptied out of desire. I think that Glazer problematizes the male fantasy of feminine desire and unconditional male enjoyment, born out of a contextual culture that gave rise to Me Too and the uncomfortable homology between a certain type of male desire and predation. Glazer masculinizes the alien's desire. He transmutes her lust into violence. And although the liberated woman is conceived as the aspiration of a progressive society, the alien's minder, like Glazer, knows that the woman who is the pornographic trope, completely free from the weight of prohibition, is in fact born of male fantasy. When women are urged to know their own desire, the effects don't emancipate, says Angell. They reinforce existing misogynistic beliefs. Now, for Lacan, desire is always baffling. It's always insatiable. And indeed, exactly as we see in the film, where we can never establish what the alien wants, none of us can ever adequately answer the question of chevoir. Fantasy, of course, exists as a mechanism to answer this question, but fantasy is necessarily characterized by its own deficiency, and the void carved out by desire, as Fabio Vighi puts it, is always unfillable. Fantasy's role is to give shape to the forever elusive and unknowable status of desire as the other's desire. But because of Das Ding's unsymbolizable nature, the men in the pool experience their entrapment as what the alien wants from them. The pool, as an analogue of Das Ding, operates as that towards which desire in the film moves, but is prohibited from. The spectator's desire, then, is ultimately only ever the desire of the other. It's that of the alien's minder. It's that of the lad's mag or the pornographic film, or even the history of eroticized female representations that exist throughout science fiction and horror cinema. Okay, and I'll finish there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Olly. Am I unmuted? I am unmuted. Thank you, Olly. That was very rich, very clear, very fascinating. As we usually do, I'm going to start off with a few questions, but if you have questions you'd like to ask, then please do stick up your Zoom hand and you can join in. You talked quite a lot about lack there, which is kind of an obvious thing to bring in this, but there was a particular lack in your discussion of the film as well, which I was very curious about. That those of you who have not seen the film, as Olly has very clearly laid out, there's this character played by Scarlett Johansson as the alien who seduces a series of men and takes them back to her lair. But there are two men that she encounters and seduces in a slightly different way, or each in a different way, that you kind of skipped over. And I was just curious as to to why you skipped those two characters over.
So are you referring to the man, the kind of chivalrous man that rescues her and carries her across the water, and the man with the disfigurement as
Yeah.
well, Adam Pearson's character? So why did I skip them over? Then there has to remain a lack in my presentation as well, Callum, and it needs to be a cavernous lack that I leave in the presentation. But no, do you know, it's those different encounters are so crucial to how lack operates in the film and to how desire operates in the film. And as much as I argue about desire existing as the other's desire, what's clear there, I think, is the movement of the alien as she becomes subjectified. So I think that, if we want to speak in purely Lacanian terms, it's almost like this is her veil of alienation, and we're seeing her moving into more of a subjective position. Although, as body, she remains set in a way. Her mark of difference is can never be human because of this artificiality about her construction. And I think that's what Glazer explores so clearly, is the way that we can overwrite so much of what the other desires into a fantasy construction in the filmic medium, that when we strip that away, it's interesting to find what the layers underneath actually are. So I skipped over it partly because of time constraints. It is something that I'll examine in when the presentation is fleshed out into a paper or a chapter. It's something that it's absolutely critical to the argument. But yes, for this evening, mostly because of time constraints and mostly because I wanted to invite the question as well.
Thank you. No, I wasn't trying to sort of identify a gap in your argument so much. It seemed very pertinent to some of what you had to say about particularly the desire of the woman, because when she encounters the character, the chivalrous man, as you called him, um, she ends up in a position of almost having sex. It's the only point in the film where she, despite all the seduction and the undressing, the only point in the film where she gets close to a sexual encounter, well, unless you include the rape at the end, which I think we can legitimately say is not a sexual encounter. The only point where she gets close to a sexual encounter is with this chivalrous man, and she discovers at this point that she's unsexed.
Mm.
So there's some desire that has been ignited there.
Mm.
So there's a shift in the film, a shift in the focus in the film from
Very much so.
That kind of external desire to an internal desire.
I think as well, from a narrative and a structural perspective, that Nick Glazer does it as a really important counterpoint to, because the man desires differently in that scene as well. And I think Glazer is, and rightly as well, and hope that this was reflected. I don't think that the film demonizes men, and I don't think that it demonizes desire either. And I hope that was clear. I think it operates as a mode of it operates as a critique of a particular mode of ideological fantasy, which I think Glazer goes to lengths to demonstrate does not exist in all areas of society. So it's not just simply a whitewash vilification of men or male desire. He needs those counterpoints, I suppose, to act as a juxtaposition to enhance the argument that he's making in terms of the critique of the predatory desire and of the oppressive forces that can control and oppress women.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder then the other character, the other male character you skipped over is the disfigured man or the deformed man, and that's a very interesting encounter there, because and I'm aware this is the way I read the film or I watched the film, that there's something much more maternal emerges from the Scarlett Johansson character at that point. That she clearly feels she comes across as she's entertained by the kind of main series of men that she encounters. The first, is it three or
Mm.
four men that she seduces? There's something in their kind of laddishness that seems to kind of almost amuse her. And then when she meets the deformed man, there's an empathy, a sympathy, a
Very
care
much so.
that emerges, which seems much more maternal. And there's
Mm.
a very odd scene then where, as talking to the audience now, you'll have seen, if you've not seen the film itself, that the Scarlett Johansson character, the alien, takes the men that she seduces back to this derelict council house, and what it looks like to me, um, inside of which is kind of like a TARDIS thing. It's much bigger on the inside. It doesn't make sense spatially or dimensionally. And there's this dark pool of kind of viscous liquid that they sink into, but she doesn't. But with the deformed man, afterwards, from the ground floor of the building, she lets him out. So there's kind of a peculiar shift there, that this pool, which can't exist inside this building, also has this kind of exit point, which
Mm.
I don't. I'm over to you. I'm asking you to explain this, because that bit of the film kind of jarred with me, or it didn't. Something odd was going on there.
Mm. I think that so I always I read that using Linda Williams' theory of the monster, which is not something that I mentioned tonight, which is the affinity between the feminine spectator and the male monster, and the when the male monster is destroyed. So I think that that's the one time in the film that we see an act of kindness from the alien, and I think it's because she feels an affinity to. I think it's the first time that she begins to feel something close to an affinity for a human being, and it's because it's as she is beginning to recognize herself as someone who is oppressed and somebody who is unable to have um, normal interactions and is unable to have agency over her own experiences. And she recognizes that in him as well, that there's something that differentiates him to the other men that she's met, although she doesn't read it sexually, and she so her desire is activated in a really different way there, and it's not in a sexual, it's not in a sexual, in terms of sexual act way. It's it's much more inquisitive, and it is much more maternal, and it's much more caring as well. But I think it's because of the recognition of the affinity between the two of them. And perhaps, Callum, that's what allows the unlocking of the pool, because the pool seems to only operate through a type of masculinist phallic desire. And when that desire ceases to occur, that's the moment that somebody can be released from it, but only then. And then you're right, that's the only time that we see it in the film. So yeah, if I was to read my reading of the film into that particular sequence, that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Someone just posted in the chat. I just sort of jump up there, that pointing out that just before she releases them, she looks in the mirror as well, which
Mm,
is a really interesting point that I'd missed. But it does seem to make that interesting link to mirror stage identification, which, I mean, you talked about ecstasy, which is kind of related to this, but that idea of um, inside and outside, and the impossibility of um, any kind of hard and fast line between inside and outside, which seems to be a really important part of what Glazer is trying to do in the film. And again, there seems to be a shift at that point in the film where we encounter the deformed man, where,
mm,
with the Johansson character, there is that kind of sense that she's a skin and only a skin, or
mm,
what's beneath the skin, what's under the skin, to use the film's title, is is alien and unknowable, and um,
mm,
you can't get to it, and at no point do we get to it. And the very fact that Glazer chose to have two actresses play the alien, one with the skin, Scarlett Johansson, which is the one we all recognize, and then there's another actress who plays the alien beneath the skin. So there's
mm.
that very firm um, distinction. But when we encounter the deformed man, there is that sense of the skin being superficial.
Mm,
That's, so up until that point, the skin is it. The skin is what
mm,
we're focused on, and at that point, things shift, and
mm.
it's almost, I don't think it's said explicitly, but it's implied through the way it's filmed that she's seeing beyond the skin, under the skin.
Yeah, very much so. I think there's a really brief sequence in that scene as well, where we actually see the inner body of the alien exposed, but it's almost imperceptible because it's set against the black backdrop of the pool. So yeah, there is that exposure for the first time of her inner life, of her psyche. Prior to that, and I think it's beautifully done right at the start of the film where we see her signification for her is absolutely meaningless. It's empty speech, and we see that because she's just rehearsing like an automaton, words and syllables and phonemes and sounds. But the comment from the audience is absolutely right. That first look into the mirror represents that misidentification because she still doesn't know who she is. And there's an argument to say, is this the beginning of some kind of ego formation for her? But it is insofar as I suppose that she's able to identify. And prior to that, there is no identification from her. It's cold, it's clinical, it's removed. Whereas here, and I mean, it's so beautifully done by Glazer, isn't it? That her identification is with somebody that could not be more diametrically opposed to her visually, and that's what I think is so many of these beautiful binaries and dichotomies that Glazer uses in the film to examine the emergence of the psyche, the emergence of the subject is what makes it such a powerful piece of cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I see Alison's got her hand up, so I'm going to bring Alison in because I think she might have a comment or a question. Alison.
Sure. Hi. I just wanted to link up with Lacan's later notion that the woman doesn't exist, which, of course, he's at great pains to point out doesn't mean that women don't exist.
Mm,
But if we take the notion that the woman doesn't exist and kind of run with it, then in patriarchy, woman is only ever a masculine fantasy. I'm just asking if you want to respond to that.
mm. I mean, I think that so in Seminar 20, when Lacan's saying this, he's thinking about it in the context of the exception, isn't he? And the idea of enjoyment and how both sexes interact with the signifier differently, and how there's this type of other jouissance that only those with a feminine structuration can experience. So does Lacan think that woman is only a masculine fantasy? Well, I suppose there's in Lacan there's no the woman, is there, in a way that there is a the man. And I think that idea of the phallic exception is what the film examines. It examines this belief that there is a man out there who has this unrestrained, unconstrained access to all types of enjoyment. And it's that fantasy that I think the film critiques. I think that's precisely what Glazer is trying to do there. So he's very much using the logic of the non-rapport. And again, I only kind of sprinkled a little bit of this into my presentation this evening. But yes, I think the film certainly is operating as a critique of that type of logic, most definitely.
Thank you.
Would you agree?
Um, I'm kind of coming at this more from an understanding of Lacan than a background in film and film criticism. So I'm just I watched the film in order to participate in this seminar, and it's not the sort of thing I watch regularly. So it was a difficult watch, and not something I particularly enjoyed. But so I'm not really equipped to kind of, I don't know, engage at the level of kind of, what I think about what's going on in the film and representation and so on. But I am particularly interested in Lacanian notions of femininity.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot there.
No, it's all right. Happy.
Thanks, Alison.
Can we talk about class?
Mm.
One of the things that struck me rewatching the film, so I saw the film when it first came out at the cinemas. Was it 2014? So about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I hadn't seen it again until a couple of nights ago, and I watched it like Alison in preparation for tonight. And one of the things that struck me watching it was the way Scarlett Johansson is presented. And it kind of struck me when I was watching the other night, but it seemed much more evident when you were talking about lads mags, which the models in lads mags, or at least the models on the covers of the lads mags you're showing us, seem to be presented, they're presented against, silk sheets and kind of what looks to me like expensive underwear. And, there's something emulating a kind of high class to their presentation. The character of the alien, the Scarlett Johansson version of the alien, so the skinned, the alien with skin, seems to be presented as a very, in a very lower class way. And the setting in the film is very, suburban, urban, deprived areas, deprivated housing. There's something quite lower class about it. And not to take away from your, the very clear, well-made arguments you're making about presentation of gender and sexuality, but there seems to be a class statement going on here as well in Glazer's film. There's something that's almost a choice. And I think you made the point about the kind of equation with the sex worker, which seems, to make sense there as well. The way she's dressed in the fur coat and the marble wash jeans seems to kind of evoke that as well. But I wonder if there's anything about the class notion which seems to extend far beyond the characters, to do with the type of men she's seducing as well, the working class men that she's seducing. The film is shot a lot in either working class areas or working areas that would be frequented by working class people, like Buchanan galleries, and so there seems to be a class issue at play there.
I read it, Calum, very simply, because I turned this over in lots of different ways, and I read it quite simply as it being an analogy. So the decay that we see and the deterioration and the desolation that we see in the film as just simply being analogous with what Glazer saw as the degradation, decay of desire and sex, and what sex had been reduced to, and not so much it's certainly not in a classist way, because I don't think that he is like that in this film whatsoever. But I think that he's very aware that the types of cultural products that I think the film critiques primarily target the working class reader and the working class culture. So I think he wanted to align those narrative and aesthetic elements with an area of culture which he was not being judgmental about or classist about. But I think he wanted there to be a clear alignment there. That's been my reading of it.
Okay, that kind of makes sense, because I'd never occurred to me the lads mag connection, but when you said that, it kind of seemed to chime very directly with that, in the sense that they were, particularly in the 1990s, there was that whole kind of sense of lads' mags. It was very much kind of tied in with Britpop and kind of, you know, pseudo working class culture, and so that kind of makes.
I think because I think the timing of the film is crucial, because it feels quite timeless aesthetically and with its level of sophistication and camera work, etc., score. You know, everything about it is quite timeless, but it is rooted in a time, and it is rooted in a particular period. And I think it's Glazer's contribution to that shift in culture away from that debasement of women. And it's his, because he was working on that film for a long time. I think it was in production for maybe 9 or 10 years before he actually got it out. And obviously the Faber novel is from the 1990s, so it's this exact era that you describe. And although Glazer departs from the novel quite significantly, I think he wants to retain that element of this idea of predation and its association with, you know, in the same way that that pieces of meat are lined up and packaged in a particular way on shelves of a supermarket, so too were women being lined up and packaged in a particular way. So that's where I think the alignment comes from.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. The other thing that struck me when I was watching it the other night, that I don't know if it had occurred to me when I first watched it, quite a long time ago, but if it had, I've repressed it. The male character, the initial sequence of male characters that the Scarlett Johansson character seduces, when she takes them back to the pool, as you call it, they all have erections. This is something actually quite unusual in a film. You don't see male erections in cinema. And that struck me, that Glazer's doing something very purposeful here. You know, I imagine as the actors, it's not that easy to have maintain an erection on camera. So it's clearly directed as something that, you know, it's consistent through all the characters. And I wonder if, you know, you're the expert here, what's going on here? But also, to me, it seems to play into this notion of male desire, and if we think of the erect penis as being the kind of, you know, kind of putting in a very obvious way, the archetype of the phallus, then the, you know, if tumescence is the phallic male position, then detumescence is a failure of masculinity. And in this sense, the characters, you know, were in what Lacan would call the failed sexual encounter, the male always fails. I think I think Renetta Salico puts it, says something along the lines of what women want is a man who won't disappoint, and that's the female fantasy. And you kind of have that in a way in this film. That's the Scarlett Johansson character picks men who can maintain an erection. They don't fail until they're lost in the pool, which maybe where my argument falls down. I don't know. I mean, does that make sense?
No, I'm glad that you noticed that element of the film, because it passed me by when I first saw it as well, amazingly, because it's, you know, as unsubtle as the male erect penis is, he depicts it in a way that's quite subtle, insofar as the characters are removed from the camera in order to do it, and your eye is naturally drawn, certainly as a heterosexual male spectator, or just by the star appeal of Scarlett Johansson, you're more drawn towards Johansson's actions, I think, on a first viewing. So again, I think that's really deliberate by him. And you point about tumescence versus detumescence is critical as well, because once they become ensconced in the pool, they lose the erection. Yeah. So they're held in this state of arousal, because I think that, again, he's critiquing, I believe, my reading of the film, he's critiquing the what's permissible in visual culture, which is or in a certain mode of visual culture, in the lads mag, in the soft core pornographic film, or magazine, still imagery. What's permitted is the feminine body. The breasts are permitted, the abdomen's permitted, the legs, the arms, and even having no underwear on is permitted. Typically, the vulva will be prohibited, but it's okay for there to be no underwear on. But what's absolutely prohibited is the male penis, and certainly the erect penis. So what does Glazer do? He continues with this operation of inversion, and he shows you the erect penis, but then he removes it to show that the men are castrated. And that's what I think he wants. He wants to demonstrate this. As much as the phallic exception is what drives this type of male desire, men are still castrated. There's no two ways about it.
I wonder then, Alison, I see your hands. I'll come to you in a second, but just to kind of finish this point, the character at the end, the logger who attempts to rape Scarlett Johansson, interestingly, that happens in the forest. You have these huge pine trees, these huge phallic symbols surrounding him, suggesting then that this character is the one who doesn't have the erection. He supplements his lack of erection with the visual image of the phalluses around him, but also supplements it very overtly with violence.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that he's an outlier in terms of the film, and he's the only one that tries to pursue jouissance directly. But that becomes probably more horrifying for him than any other character in terms of from an effective sense. That's what we see is this pursuit of absolute otherness. It just cannot be contained within the symbolic network, and that's why he has to destroy it. That's the only way that the phallic order can maintain its logic is just through the removal and destruction of absolute otherness. So as much as it's what is driving his desire, it proves to be impossible, and that's why the film cuts at that point of impossibility.
Which kind of shows the impotence of the film itself.
And certainly yes, the impotence that it critiques.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Alison.
Yeah, I'm finding this discussion extremely interesting. So, unfortunately, I'm going to introduce a completely different topic. Having said that, I know nothing about kind of film theory and so on. There is one dimension of the film that I did find particularly disturbing and irritating, really. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts about it. And that's the soundtrack, which is incredibly repetitive. And like for me, I found it incredibly irritating and just disturbing, really. Any thoughts on that?
I don't know if I can offer you a Lacanian angle on it, Alison.
Not necessarily asking for that.
Okay. I differ from you in that I found that its discordance was really effective to accentuate the disturbing nature of the sequences that it framed. I actually saw I didn't realize this, but when I was quite young, I actually went and saw the composer Mika Levy at a gig in Newcastle. One of my friends told me that a couple of years ago. But I'm actually quite fond of that style of music as well, Alison. But you're absolutely right. There's loads of it it's really, really unsettling. It gets under your skin. And that's the exact point, is that these scenes could not be comfortable watch. It's a deeply disturbing film. It's a deeply disturbing film. But I think that's what makes it such a powerful film, because Glazer used his full repertoire of cinematic skills to dislocate you as a spectator, and he does that orally. He does it visually, and he does it through his characterization and his camera work and everything else. And I think that the kind of cumulative impact of that is that you should always be, there's not really a moment's respite in that film, and you're forced. I think that the score as well really forces you to, it dislocates your identification as well, because you're given the mode of identifying, which is the alien. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, because we don't know what her desire is, but what we do see of her is absolutely devastating and horrifying. And we see her complete indifference to thing, I mean, I have young children, and watching the sequence where the baby's left on the beach. I mean, I've seen it so many times, but even so, every single time I view that, I'm really twisting in my seat. And obviously the sequence at the end with the attempted rape. These are such challenging things to watch. And I think filmically, what the score does is it just makes you that little bit more uncomfortable, and it hopefully opens up something in the unconscious. It allows something of your own unconscious to emerge, because you've been uprooted in such a way in your viewing experience. But yeah, it's not something that I would necessarily have as a soundtrack in my car. Although there is one of the songs that I do have on a playlist because I'm quite fond of it. But no, I wouldn't recommend it for kind of light listening or light viewing, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose there might be some mileage in I don't know, trying to think about the particular sort of jouissance, through the score, through the soundtrack.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, I agree. I haven't read any analysis just specifically of the score, but in a lot of the scholarship on the film, the score is mentioned. But I think it's a really underexplored area of the film, because I think it carries a lot of weight in terms of how disruptive it is to your experience as a spectator. So yeah, from that perspective, Alison, I completely agree with you.
Okay, thanks.
There's kind of interesting interplay in the score, isn't there? That a lot of the score is, again, for those who've not seen the film or heard the film, a lot of the score is a drone. It's kind of like ongoing drone. So it's, would fit into the category of drone music. But that's where a lot of drone music is quite soothing. And, some people find it very annoying because it's repetitive. But I think there is a kind of, on some level, almost a kind of infantile, matrixial level. The drone is something quite soothing, relaxing is maybe the wrong word, but sleeping.
Comforting, maybe.
Yeah, there is a comfort to it. But in what Mika Levy does in this film is she intersperses that not with dramatic disruption of the drone, but that very subtle disruption. So the drone turns into something menacing, annoying. There's this kind of microtones that kind of start to irritate and disturb the drone. So there is something very powerful going on there. If you listen to her other music, it's not all, it's recognizable as her music, but a lot of her other music, particularly her film work, doesn't work in that way. It's much more palatable, because she's doing something very particular in this film to play off that kind of soothing, disrupting thing, which I think matches something that's going on with the character as well.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. We've kind of got to 8:30, which brings us to the end of Lacan Scotland for this evening. I don't see any last questions jumping up, so I think it just falls to us to say thank you very much to Olly for a fascinating presentation. If you haven't seen the film, I hope this has piqued your interest and you'll go off and watch the film. If you have seen the film, I hope it's piqued your interest and you'll go off and watch the film again with different eyes and see different things in it. Olly, you certainly made me see the film differently, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Interesting opening up of a film and a really good exercise, an example of how we can use Lacan's theory to interrogate film and to start to see film functioning in a more complex and more significant way. So really fantastic work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you're new to Lacan in Scotland, please do sign up and get our updates. We have now got a full program up on our website. So we have speakers in place for the last Thursday of every month for the year. A really interesting range of people, some names which I imagine will be familiar to many of you, covering topics ranging from dance to psychosis, to close readings of Lacan's seminars. So lots of interesting stuff there. So please do sign up for our bulletins and updates, and come back and join us next month at the end of November, which if you're joining us in the United States is Thanksgiving. In fact, if you're joining us anywhere, it's Thanksgiving, but you're probably more likely to be celebrating that if you're in the United States or commiserating it. So last Thursday of November, and we'll be joined by Dan Collins, who'll be talking about aspects or an aspect of Lacan's Seminar 16, which, given Dan's attention to detail and really, really fantastic work on Lacan, it promises to be a really interesting session. So please do join us then. For now, thank you very much for joining us.